This
is where prescriptive care
meets preventative.
Where information meets motivation.
and where fast service
meets lasting wellness. Thank you.
This is CVS Health Hub.
We aren't just reimagining our stores.
We're reimagining our roles.
Creating healthcare that's more accessible,
More personal.
Better connected.
And more comprehensive.
We're expanding our products and services.
They do a lot here.
So we can live our purpose, helping people
On their path to better health.
By keeping it simple
and lowering costs.
By improving individual outcomes.
and entire communities.
by empowering every patient.
And empowering each other.
Hey, Nicole, I wanted to get your opinion on something.
Yes, absolutely.
To make this happen,
We need all of you.
Is there something I can help you with?
All of us.
Working together. Hey, Hazel, this is John. He's got a question I think you might know the answer to.
sure, absolutely. How can I help you?
Welcome to CVS Health Hub.
Our new
Exciting.
Rewarding approach.
To total health.
Having the internet has allowed me to explore my passions and create new ones. Over the last few months, I've been working on a children's book. It's all about a kid with big dreams who wants to succeed at all kinds of things. Sometimes he doubts himself. He wonders if he should be more realistic. But he works hard, he keeps dreaming big, and he goes on to achieve amazing things. It's meant to be a lesson for kids, but it's also a reminder for me to show the world what I can do.
And thank you for joining the Legislative Redistricting panel. We are so excited about the topic today. We look forward to really sharing some experience with our panelists today with all of our legislative members who are really on the cusp of trying to figure out how to make sure that the redistricting process in their state benefits not only our community, but benefits the nation as a whole. As sure as summer follows spring, the national census that we just completed at the end of October is going to play a major role in what redistricting will look like. There's nothing more important to us after the census than the conversation about redistricting and the work that will commence as a result of redistricting. The United States Congress gives each state the responsibility to draw state legislative and congressional district boundaries. And our panelists today are going to give you the 101 about redistricting. But to do that, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the census to lay the framework, and that's what we'll do. This afternoon, we have joining us Mr. Ron Holmes, who is from the great state of Illinois, who has a long legislative history working with the House and the Senate around issues about census representation for Black communities. And so I want to welcome Mr. Ron Holmes to this panel, and he will talk a little bit more about his background in a few seconds. I also want to welcome one of my great colleagues from the great state of Maryland, Ms. Janelle Wilkins, who is with us and has been on the front line of the issue of census and redistricting and the impact of this very important legislative process to NBCSL, as well as to many, many organizations for which she is a member. And Ms. Janelle will also introduce herself in a few seconds. I am Representative Carol Ammons from the great state of Illinois. I represent the 103rd District. I was a member of the State Census Advisory Panel and also worked on census and redistricting at the local level as a member of the Champaign County Board. I was involved with the current map that we have in Champaign County, which was really drawn with the impact of the Black community in mind. With that, I'm going to send it over to Mr. Ron Holmes to further introduce himself, and then we're going to get right into our questions for our panelists today.
Thanks, Rep. Ammons. My name is Ron Holmes. I'm a political consultant here in Illinois. This time 10 years ago, I was the public facilitator for Illinois' redistricting process, chosen by both the House and the Senate to craft not only our legislative maps, but also the congressional map that we passed in Illinois. And I'm looking really forward to this dialogue today as each of you embark upon your journey of getting maps done to make sure that the right people are represented in your respective chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. And with that, I'll send it to Delegate Janelle Wilkins.
Thank you so much, Representative Ammons, and to NBCSL for convening this important discussion. I am Janelle Wilkins, a state delegate in Maryland. I represent District 20, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. It includes Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, and White Oak. I am the parliamentarian of the House of Delegates and also served as the House representative to the statewide Complete Count Committee. And I work full-time at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights as the Director of State and Local Government Affairs, where we held a nationwide census counts campaign that helped to ensure a fair and accurate count.
Thank you, Delegate Wilkins. And thank you all for joining us for this very important discussion this afternoon. Because it is so important, legislators typically invest a considerable amount of time and effort into building goodwill, favorable name recognition in their districts, campaigns, newsletters, all of these things that we do, so that when we get to this moment, we can make sure that we have representative democracy. Why is redistricting important, and how do we get to the point of starting to consider and draw maps? Why don't we start with you, Delegate Wilkins, and then I'll come back to Mr. Holmes.
Redistricting is critical because this is representation. We have a representative democracy. And so that the way that our lines are drawn help determine power in this country. The way that lines are drawn can make sure that communities are actually fairly represented. And so there's so much at stake when we talk about redistricting. And I really have to make sure that we continue the conversation around the census that we just started off with in our opening introductions, because one of the ways that we have to ensure fair redistricting is that we have to have accurate data from the 2020 census. And that fight is still happening now. NBCSL was at the forefront, and we worked so hard, especially under your leadership, Representative Ammons, to ensure that our communities are counted. However, right now there's an entire discussion going on about the Census Bureau being able to process the data that has been collected during the response period and their ability to make sure that errors are corrected and that they actually have the time to ensure that our data is accurate. Imagine having wrong information and trying to draw our districts. That is a disaster for us. So right now, in terms of timeline, what's taking place is that the US Census Bureau is saying, by law, we have to get this information to you by December 31st, but because of COVID-19 and all of the delays and disasters that have taken place, it looks like the Census Bureau is saying they won't even be able to get the information to the federal government in terms of congressional reapportionment until late February, potentially. They're looking at either late January or sometime in February. So our timeline is way off, and we're really trying to figure out when we are going to actually have the data to redistrict and make sure that it's high quality as well.
So I'm going to come back to a question that we'll consider around timeline, but I want to go to Mr. Holmes and ask the same question. Why redistricting, and what does the census have to do with drawing of legislative districts?
Yeah, our democracy only works when the least of these are represented. And the only way that they're going to be represented is by an accurate count that's done at the census level. And then obviously a redistricting process that ensures that faces that look like them, people that come from their communities, are able to coalesce in legislative chambers across the country. Look, when we talk about the redistricting process, a lot of folks look at it specifically through a political lens, but we should also just be very deliberate in how we talk about making sure that redistricting also relates directly to like how hospitals are funded, how education funding works in various states, how you make sure that not just your state legislative chambers are drawn the right way, but every municipality underneath is drawn the right way. So, redistricting is critical because it's going to determine how conversations take place for the next 10 years all across the country.
So you've touched on a few things. Of course, there's money tied to this process, right? As we just completed the census for 2020, what we saw is that states, many states, invested little to no dollars into ensuring what you've just described, Mr. Holmes, that communities of color, those who are not represented in the democracy, have a voice and a seat at the table. How does that impact then? If Illinois invested, of course, millions of dollars, as you know, but many states invested $0. So how do we get to what would be considered fair maps without investment from the state level?
You can't, is the flat out answer. The reality is that states that have chose not to invest in efforts to make sure that hard to count communities are properly counted, they're doing it for intentional reasons. They don't want those communities counted, so that when these policy discussions are being had in various legislative chambers, there are folks that will not have their voices represented in an accurate way. Really, as far as like the count itself, a lot of the work that both you and the delegate have been doing has been around advocacy in your very own communities, right? Talking to your neighbors, talking to your churches about the need to make sure that your community is counted. That work has been done, right? And now we are in the hands of a federal process that hasn't been kind to us in various other aspects of how government has functioned over the last 4 years. But certainly we're gonna have to continue to make sure that we're raising our voices to make sure that the proper departments are analyzing this data in the right way, and again, are abiding by the timelines that are gonna allow full vetting to occur at each legislature across the country.
So that brings me back to you, Delegate Wilkins. I mean, the timeline is off, right? So because we don't have the census data, right? It's not gonna make it to Congress in time. What is it that states and legislative bodies need to do in the process of redistricting, which is supposed to start in 21? Actually, our commission will start getting formulated early in January.
Legislators should really start asking their state agencies and the state leaders who are directly responsible for redistricting about the backup plans and how they are planning for a delay in the data. The fact is, because of COVID-19, many of the processes of the census, whether it's non-response, when people started knocking on doors, if you recall, when it was time to knock on doors back in late March, we were at peak coronavirus. And so that process was delayed. And by that being delayed, everything ended up being pushed back. And so right now, legislatures should be planning for what takes place now if our data does not arrive until late. By statute, when it comes to the states getting the data, that is supposed to happen in April, by April 1st of the year after the census. So April 1st is the timeline. However, we're just not sure at this point if the states are going to have the data in their hands by April 1st. And so there should definitely be planning. And as legislators, we should be asking questions and making sure that we are prepping for some plan Bs if that information is not available.
So let me just say that I think that what I've heard from both of you is that what's at stake in redistricting really, and why we should be doing this, is basically everything from the appropriation of these dollars to drawing the district lines where you don't divide my house in half and put my husband in one district and put me in another. We've seen some crazy maps, right? In this case, every effort that we need to make as Black legislators to make sure that our communities are not just represented, but they're not all stacked in one area, which is a concern that we talked about a couple of years ago, about this whole process of stacking us in one area. So we only have one person that comes out as opposed to multiple. So everything is at stake. And yet we're in this kind of flux moment that we don't know if we're going to get the data in time to even draw any of the maps, which I believe is a constitutional requirement, right?
Right, that's correct. It's that the many state constitutions have the particular dates listed in the Constitution. However, it's by congressional statute that says that apportionment data has to be provided by December 31st, that the state data must be provided by April 1st.
Okay, so that kind of sets the time frame and timeline, but there are many shifting pieces in between. Ron, you have been involved in this process for some time in the state of Illinois, for sure. What can legislators expect in the redistricting process that we will experience in Illinois, but others will as well across the country?
Yeah, I always say that the budget is the most political bill that anyone can pass in the legislature on any given year. The reality is that in this year, redistricting will be clearly the most political thing that's done over the next 10 years. And because of that, it's critical that legislators understand how the district that they're currently sit in was drawn. And what are the reasons around that? And doing the homework and having the legal rationale to maintain shapes if they so desire, or also making sure that the right advocacy groups are prepared to lobby other members of the legislature about what their district should look like. The reality is this: we know that there's an American Community Survey that comes out a couple of years before the actual official count is done. So most legislators should have an idea of whether or not they're going to have to pick up or get rid of constituents, right, during the redistricting process. That is one clear thing that people can look at. The second thing that they can look at is just knowing the laws and the levers that they have at their disposal, given what's in state statute. In some cases, legislatures themselves are going to take the lead on drawing maps. In other cases, independent commissions, or in the cases of Iowa, a random computer will draw maps. So just knowing what those pressure points are important. And then I would say the third thing is making sure, again, that the advocacy piece is done, so that it's not just you advocating for, how a district should be shaped, or making sure that you're not packed in with another legislator, so that, that way there's an outside group of constituents that can also talk to the press about why things are shaped a certain way. It's really easy to just take a look at a map and say, oh, this looks ugly, it looks gerrymandered, and that always will happen with, ironically, Black and Latino caucus districts. So having that legal rationale, so why your district is drawn a certain way, having the backing from constituents, and then again, having an understanding of the law behind everything will put you in a much better place for when things really heat up once those numbers come out.
So you just pointed out two things that I wanted to throw to Delegate Wilkins, because these are important points, and maybe she can add to that. Population, how was my current district drawn? That would be a good tip for legislators to start digging into, well, how did that district get drawn that you're in? And then the laws of your state and the leverage that you may have to fight for your constituents or to protect the representation in your house. Delegate Wilkins, would you add other tips to that particular list as we start looking at the legislative expectations about redistricting and the process?
Yes, absolutely. I think Ron just hit the nail on the head with those points. And I think it really shows why, as legislators, we need to be talking to each other, especially seasoned legislators and newer legislators. I have worked on this issue of redistricting, but as a 4-year member of the legislature, I haven't been in office during an actual redistricting process. So connecting with my more seasoned colleagues and really understanding how the process really works, because we all know that there's what's on paper and there's our official processes, right? But then the actual powers and how all of this is working out is a whole nother conversation. So I would add the need for us to really organize ourselves, be in communication around the various levers and how the political aspect of this has worked in the past. And also really starting to think through, what are the principles? What do we believe in when it comes to redistricting? Is there something that we can come together around, whether I'm in a chamber where I have a lot of power around this or a little bit of power around it, depending on how our politics and our numbers are? We can help drive the conversation around the type of redistricting that we want to see in our communities and our states.
I think there's something else that really jumped out at me as you guys described, how to position the members, how the members should be positioning themselves for the expected fight, right? In some states, there will be independent commissions. In our state, the legislative body will draw those maps. And then at some point, we're going to have to defend, right? So as legislators, I think about the fight that we will experience here in Illinois. There's another piece of this that will directly impact Black legislators, because often we see now this issue between the Black caucus and the Latino caucus. And usually when we're drawing maps, we start seeing our minority caucus members being put as casualties of war, if you allow me to describe it that way, casualties of war in the process of redistricting. But we also have the Republican members that are also, unfortunately, in the current climate that we're in, they are literally ready to blow up the whole entire system. So what we see happening around these attempted coups in the Republican caucus that's across the United States, we have this other thing that we have to worry about as well. How do we start preparing for those kind of fights?
Caucuses have to come together. Sometimes there can be dividing lines between us on issues, but this is the time to come together and again around those principles and building coalition around the type of redistricting that we want to see, one that preserves and even amplifies our communities and our districts. I think that it's so critical in this time to make sure that we're building that coalition and starting now to do that, as opposed to, waiting around for the data or for the commissions and the various processes to start.
Ron, would you give us a couple thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, this is an extraordinarily political process. And what I will say is that in most states, members of minority caucuses are actually in the driving seat. We know that the Voting Rights Act helps a lot with protecting majority minority districts. Obviously, Emmons, I know you have an influence district, but starting a map from the very fundamentals that voting rights districts are going to take care of first will allow, I think, both Democrats and Republicans to kind of come to the Black and Latino caucuses if they're on the same page on that point. Now, it is extraordinarily hard to pull that off in certain legislatures just because of other issues that are happening, whether that be things as simple as like where the census money went or legitimate policy issues. But this is definitely one of those issues where Black and brown legislators are stronger together.
That's a very good point, because I recall one of our professors here at the U of I who sent me some research that he was doing around this issue, and he pointed out this point, and I want to share it with you all and just kind of get your feedback before we move on to the next question. He said, in particular, in the early mid 20th century was a time of great population upheaval, meaning Black folks was moving around a lot, with people being driven from the countryside of the South, right, to the major cities of the North during several periods of our history, of course, post-enslavement, the Great Depression, the World Wars. People started moving, the mechanism of agriculture changed that as well. Because of this migration, districts, we had been so underrepresented in the 1900s. By the 1960s, there was a huge malapportionment for Black people in particular. We saw that up until the 60s. And so several, of course, landmark legislative measures at the Supreme Court level kind of gave us a little bit of a reprieve there. We don't have a Supreme Court right now. We don't have a Supreme Court that's going to protect us, right, about representation. What should we do as we continue to try to bring some allyship there, some community alliances, get people in our districts involved around this appropriation question, and to make sure that we don't lose the gains that we have gained from 1960? What is it that we want to make sure our colleagues have as they go into some of the more difficult states that they're seated in?
Well, something that I would add is that redistricting is absolutely critical. It's going to be one of the important issues that we all face as legislators in the next year. However, we also have to make sure that in the next legislative session, we are advocating and supporting and championing policies that also expand representation, the right to vote. We saw this play out in the last election. We had so many challenges. It also forced us to do new things like expanding vote by mail and making sure that we are providing the right balance of options so that everyone's able to vote. So I would say that on top of the issue of redistricting, we're going into session shortly, and we should be making sure that not only are we preparing for this political and really critical process of redistricting, but that opportunities to expand the right to vote at the state level, and bills that we'll see in Congress as well, that we're expanding the franchise and expanding representation in other ways as well.
That's a very good point, because as we start drawing these legislative districts, we have to consider all of these other mechanisms and factors.
Exactly.
As we decide to draw those. But redistricting, as Ron said, this is a political issue. There are policy implications on drawing legislative districts that we need to figure out. And now we have this mechanism. If we can kind of turn to the mechanism for a second, our former AG, Attorney General, has a process that he's working on to try to draw fair maps that may or may not look like what Illinois looks like, for instance, where we have a democratically controlled legislative body, House and Senate. What are we going to do around mechanisms? What should members be looking at? Because there are commissions, there's independent committees, there's how do we make sure that our people are on those bodies, and how do we give them enough information to prepare for that process, the mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about NBCSL is that you have a huge sample size of what the politics are in various states. And this gets back to why I say it's so important that folks know the levers that they have over the course of this process. They're going to, as someone that's been named to three lawsuits here in Illinois about the redistricting process, I can tell you that it's the guise of reform will be the thing that folks use for suppression. And it's very important to know whether or not you're in a position where your districts, the way that they're drawn, are for reform, or if there's something that actually basically entail regression. And what I mean by that is that, you talked a little bit more about the migration that's occurred, and we have historic gains in every, legislative chamber across the country, with now more minority legislators than ever, certainly at the congressional level. There will be folks that say, well, you guys had a Black president, you now have a Black VP. It proves that, you don't
slow down, that's enough.
Constituents to have a Black district. And folks should be very careful about that slippery slope. Because, if these lines aren't drawn the right way, again, you lose a debate for 10 years, or you lose your power, rather, about like how you can actually influence people for the betterment of not only your community, but the other Black constituents across the state or municipality that you might live in.
That's such a good, I love the way you said the guise of reform. Delegate Wilkins, the guise of reform, what are we looking for? How do we protect ourselves from that?
Well, I think one thing is that we have to be proactive in understanding the process and making sure that the letter of the law in our Constitution is being followed. Some states actually have specific provisions around what redistricting has to look like. Some of them are very specific, some are broad. And when we understand what those are, we can better be armed with the tools to argue and make the case against any reforms that really and truly do not actually benefit our community and that actually might violate the law. So I think us all understanding what are the requirements is something that is a really critical tool in making sure that we are protecting our communities and ensuring fair redistricting.
And you were going to give us the guise of reforms that you was going to expand on. I want to get that in.
Yeah, let me just give a couple of examples. You're going to hear, if you're in, for example, a state in which you're in the minority party, chances are the majority party is going to say, hey, well, we'll give you 75, 80% minority districts, right? And they'll do it at the expense of potentially drawing influence districts like the one, Representative Ammons represents. So it's really important to just know, again, packing is a problem. You don't have to have a 95% Black district to be an effective Black legislator. Share the wealth. The second thing that you're going to hear a lot about is shapes. And, this idea that people live in squares or perfectly, rounded elements or geographic boundaries like roads and bridges just isn't true. So if your state has things like substantially equal in population as a requirement for redistricting, that means you're going to have some jagged edges and things are not going to look like pretty squares. And, knowing that up front so that you're not caught off, blindsided by an editorial board is important. So yeah, it's always just important to know like what these things are that might be, sound like reform that are actually detrimental to our communities.
I think that is such a great point. Often we look at the maps, and of course, I look at the map of Illinois, and we're a majority Democratic controlled legislature. And all the articles I read, all of them, look at this weird shape and look at this and look at, but they don't context it. So let's try to context that a little further around the shapes, because some people may actually fall into that ideology that the shape determines something's wrong, right? Janelle, can you talk about that? Does the shape determine that something's wrong, or what other factors determine what's wrong with this map?
Absolutely. It's not just the shape. We can play a little game where we can put up a bunch of different shapes of different maps and just guess which ones are gerrymandered and which ones aren't. And we would probably be wrong most of those times. It definitely goes deeper. We really have to look at making sure that communities are not overly packed, but also making sure that communities are not purposefully segregated in order to water down the vote. Those are probably two of the top things to look out for, because we see particularly with race and ethnicity, that takes place a whole lot. And I would also point out that we have to remember that we're looking at congressional redistricting and we're also looking at state redistricting. And sometimes the laws in your state constitution can be different for the two. So we have to also ensure that we understand the process and the laws for both, so that things like the district being contiguous, things like overpacking, and if those are addressed in your state laws, they could be addressed in different ways. So we want to make sure we're also aware of that.
So what I've taken away from your comment is that some redistricting criteria are codified or based on legal interpretation. That is right. That's already set precedent for this conversation. And some are merely custom or preference, right? So we got to make sure we understand the difference between what is legally based and it's already been challenged, and then what is customary, or preference of that particular state, and have to be careful about looking at both of those things, all three of those things, as Ron said, the guise of reform, because some of this will, we want to make sure that you have certain amount of representation, but it may diminish the number of members, right? So some of those things will become a factor. In most states where we have these legislative districts drawn, as Ron has said, we've gained obviously representation, numeric representation across the country since 1960. But in the process, most of our members, I think maybe NBCSL has this, and if not, this will be a great thing for us to look at, is how many of our members have been in the General Assemblies, that they are a part of that body for at least one or two remaps, right? How much of a deficit will that be? I'm a new member. I've only done this at the local level. I've not done this at the state level. How many of our members are going to be in this kind of quasi-dependent role, and where are we going to get that support? Hopefully the answer is NBCSL will help us figure out what would be needed for each of these states. But what should we look at for those bodies that most of the members are new and haven't been there for more than 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a state with term limits, you might be in that position. And, what I always say about the redistricting process, as with any other civil rights complaint, is this is where you try to lean on your Urban League and your NAACP chapters, right? Chances are they either were defendants or litigants on whatever the map was that was previously adopted. But outside of that, yeah, it is literally a matter of just brain share. And I think the idea that conversations like this are happening and will probably continue to happen under, you all's leadership, is critical so that folks can talk about, okay, like, my chamber leader is telling me X, Y, Z. What do you think about this? And then you can be like, no, that's ridiculous. You don't want to do that. Go back with X, ABC. I mean, those conversations are critical that happen here at NBCSL.
That's a very important point, because we need a repository ultimately, where in states that you are certainly in the minority, and you don't have the representation to ensure certain things, that we have enough advocacy to fight for these other points. I think there are 3 criteria that the Supreme Court established. I think this was in 1980s, but one of them that the Supreme Court noted was that the court requires that all districts for a given chamber be substantially equal in population. And that was one of those things that, coming out of the 60s, of course, we were not substantially equal in representation whatsoever. And now here we are. We got to make sure that members understand what the Supreme Court requires, the substantial equal. But the Supreme Court also, in our lifetime, gutted Section 5. How is that going to impact what this looks like when they consider substantially equal? How is that going to impact us, the Voting Rights Act?
I think in regards to the Supreme Court, that is such an important point. Not only do we have challenges over the makeup of our current Supreme Court, but this is going to be the first redistricting process that takes place after Shelby County v. Holder, where the Voting Rights Act was really gutted in terms of pre-clearance. And we've seen just so many changes to state laws that have hurt communities of color and low-income communities when it comes to being able to access the right to vote. So not only do we have challenges around redistricting, but we already have lost a lot of ground when it comes to the right to vote because of that court case. But at the same time, we've actually seen indications, at least in Maryland, where I'm from, we have had challenges in the courts regarding our congressional redistricting. Are some of our districts looking a little funny when it comes to redistricting? And actually what the courts came back and said was that we're not in the business of drawing your lines or telling you how your line should be drawn. They agreed that our districts looked a little funny. There could be a little gerrymandering going on, but they literally were hands off and said, we just believe this is beyond the scope of our work. So we should also take that to mean that this is potentially up to us when it comes to being able to get to the Supreme Court. Now we have a new Supreme Court, of course, but in terms of precedents, at least what took place in Maryland, that really gives us an indication that a lot of this is going to be on us to get it right.
Are there current, and I don't know the answer to this right now because I'm looking at some maybe dated data from research, but have either of you seen any legal or current lawsuits that will impact this right now, besides, of course, all of Trump's lawsuits about the voting? Have you all seen any other lawsuits that will impact this current process of redistricting?
There are 2 lawsuits taking place, at least 2 that I know of, taking place right now regarding the census that will absolutely impact redistricting. One is looking at the fact that President Trump had issued an executive order saying that for purposes of the congressional apportionment, that he would like all undocumented immigrants to be removed, and that the Census Bureau was instructed to remove undocumented immigrants from the data. So that's one, and that's obviously a huge concern, huge problem that would impact many of our districts. The second one is related to what we talked about regarding the deadlines. The Trump administration, originally understanding the various delays with the census, agreed that deadline should be pushed back from December 31st to April so that the Census Bureau has the time to process all the data and make corrections. However, they did an about face and decided that a hard deadline of December 31st was what they wanted to get behind. And so there are lawsuits, and there's also a federal bill to make sure that that deadline is pushed back so that the Census Bureau has the time to really process the data and do all of its work. And again, all of that deals with accurate data and us actually having as correct information as possible when we redistrict.
So that's one of those things that we want to make sure that members, as you begin to study, because now we all become students of this process, right? Because we got to learn and act at the same time. We have to take those kind of things, the legal battles into consideration, the census data, which is not readily available to us according to regular schedule. The third thing that I wanted to kind of throw out to you all, I know our panel is going pretty fast. The time is going pretty fast, but I wanted to throw out to both of you an additional consideration. We just came out of our 2020 election. We will be inaugurating Joe Biden as the new president and our VP in January. How does all of that factor into the lawsuits, the changes, of course, with the census data? How is all of that, from your estimation, going to factor in? And I guess, Ron, you can start. I'm sorry, Ron, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that you now have a new Commerce Department, and conversations around sampling and around how counts are accurately reflected are certainly going to take place. Functionally, the real reality is that this is an issue that will be litigated in the judiciary after states pass their respective maps. The executive branch of the federal government will have little to no say other than being a bully pulpit on redistricting issues moving forward. Certainly, the DOJ will be interested about issues of suppression, but it's not really going to change a lot because the Trump administration is administered over the count thus far.
Ms. Janelle, you want to give a couple thoughts on that as I'm going to get us wrapped up because I know our time is going quickly.
Yes, a major issue that is taking place during the transition really has to do with who is going to be in the White House when the Census Bureau hands over the data for apportionment. If it happens on December 31st, our current president is going to be in the White House and is going to be the one who will be determining that apportionment in terms of the number of seats in the various states, members of Congress. If this takes place in February or late January, it'll be a completely different president. So thinking about that, I think we can understand the implications of what we've seen in terms of the history of President Trump, especially in recent weeks and months, around upholding our democratic principles. There is certainly a lot of politics at play, and there are huge implications for when this data gets in the hands of the president, not only because we also need this information later on because we want to redistrict, but also the political aspect that we've been talking about as it relates to who is in power and how our democratic principles are implemented.
So we have a lot that we need to consider. I took some notes from you wonderful scholars in this area because I think your experience is extremely valuable to the members of NBCSL and to our communities at large. During this process, our best recommendation to legislative members that I recorded from this conversation is study, understand what your state's process is and how your legislative district was drawn if you weren't a member at that time, like myself, to really understand and study the previous apportionment and how the district came to be. We also want to make sure members understand at the local level, of course, because we're going to be drawing districts for the congressional members, which impacts what the locals draw for local membership, county boards, municipalities, and other governmental agencies that's going to actually have to draw maps as well. I used to serve on the county board, so I'm familiar with that process. Should people be looking out for compactness? Should they be looking out for packing in their states to make sure that you don't lose membership where you can prevent that? But in the state of Illinois, where our largest municipality is Cook County, Ron, we lost some population. what are our members in Illinois supposed to look out for in relationship to that? Of course, that's tied to the census numbers. We don't know what they are. What should we be looking out for in relationship to loss of population in some areas?
Yeah, the funny thing about that is that we also lost 200,000 people during the last map, and we're, again, able to make sure that we didn't regress in the gains that Black legislators have made in representation in the legislature. Regression has to be a key theme for Black caucuses across the country that are worried about population loss due to outward migration due to this economy. So again, I mean, I just think that knowing the numbers and knowing the levers at your disposal are important. And then also just recognizing from a purist and ethical lens that, you know, if people have moved, that means that you might not have the same numbers in your district that you had 10 years ago, but you can probably run effectively over the next 10 years if you've been doing a good job.
I think that's such a valuable point because, of course, we want to make sure that we have as much representation across the state and across the country as possible. But we also want to make sure that we don't feel so blocked in by needing 75, 80% Black voters in a particular district. Doesn't necessarily mean that you need that in order to continue with good representation. Representative, well, we are representatives, you guys are delegates, right? Delegate Wilkins, can you give us your last best recommendation to our members going into a very dicey moment, right, in this process of redistricting?
I think study, as you said, we all should be students of redistricting and how it works for our particular state, and contacting each other, talking to each other, working together, organizing and understanding what has taken place. I would really re-emphasize that. And the last thing I would mention is we really should start considering and talking about in our different states, having our own consultants, especially for our Black caucuses, to really look at the specific numbers, crunch the numbers for us, understand the impact of how our districts could look. And when the draft maps are drawn, to be able to react to that and help us. We should really be thinking about pooling those resources as Black caucuses, to have our own Ron Holmes in our caucuses to help us determine how all of this could work and impact our districts.
That was so awesome because you just gave Mr. Ron Holmes another job. I'm gonna be paying him right away to help Illinois Black caucus members do this work, because I think that is a very good point. If anything that we can give people to walk away with, certainly we want them to study this issue. Study this issue, study your own district, how it became. Review the last redistricting process. A few months ago, I looked at our last redistricting process because I wasn't there, and realized that one of our great senators, Senator Carol Mosley Braun, was so instrumental in making sure that we protected Black caucus members and those districts throughout the state of Illinois, where a person like me could come out of a district that is not a majority minority district. So that was a very important role that she played, and we need those members that were either former members, could be former members who were part of redistricting and have a little bit of an analysis that they can share with our members. We also want to look at, do some comparative analysis on redistricting state by state, so that we are familiar with what's happening with our members in other states, and we can look and say, oh, that's not necessarily a good thing. As Ron said, that's not a good thing. It's not really a reform. It's really a guise of a reform. And that will help us figure out what protections are necessary. And then lastly, I think for our members who are thinking about this whole electoral process, it is not the same state by state. As we know, Attorney General Holder has a redistricting committee that he is working with to try to protect members in other states and provide some fairness in those states and limit the gerrymandering that happens by way of our Republican colleagues who may be in control of those legislatures, and what we can do to push back on that. And I know he'll be a part of this conference this year to talk about their findings around this issue. I believe that our time has expired together with this panel. I do want to thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion. There is so much more to do around this issue, and I believe that NBCSL will put up some tools, tips, research papers, and books of that nature, which we can recommend some of those things, so NBCSL members will know where to start this discussion. With that, I will thank all of our participants for this session. Thank NBCSL for allowing me to participate as a member and a moderator for this panel. Certainly thank you, Delegate Wilkins, for joining us, and thank you, Mr. Ron Holmes, the guru for Illinois that we will be hiring to help us with this redistricting conversation. And with that, we bid you good work around redistricting in the next cycle.
If ever there was a time to see the need, it's now. The need for people managers across your organization who have solid leadership and people skills. Managers who know what to say and do to help rebuild your business, recover your culture, and keep your people going strong. We're not talking crisis skills, but the real-world management and team skills all managers should have, especially now. Do yours? Order SHRM's new People Manager qualification.
I felt like when I took the full-time role, not only was it Walmart inviting me in to join the team, but I also felt comfortable here.
Over 95,000 temporary COVID hires hired permanently since March. Live better together. Walmart.